the King Arthur guy, and this is the 11th and final episode. So in this episode, I want to give a synopsis of the Arthurian legend and talk about certain specific aspects of the story. So the story begins in Britain in the 5th century. Uther Pendragon is king of the Britons, and Uther is greatly attracted to Igraine, the wife of Duke Gorlios of Cornwall. So Uther convinces the wizard Merlin to alter his appearance so that he looks like Gorlios so that he can sleep with Igraine. Now this is a type of story that was fairly common in ancient Europe. It tells how the hero could be such a significant person because it gives the hero supernatural origin. Sometimes these stories were told about real people, sometimes they were told about fictional characters. So this raises the question as to where did Uther Pendragon come from? Some people believe he was real. I'm in the camp that says no, he was fictional. So we'll start with the name. Uther Pendragon means the terrible head dragon, and the medieval Welsh used dragon as a synonym for ruler. Terrible as in spreading terror, so I suppose actually terrifying would be a better modern translation, since we tend to give different associations to the word terrible. But anyway, there is a theory that I agree with that says that this actually originated as an epithet for Arthur himself. Arthur was Uther Pendragon, the terrifying head ruler, and that somehow it got turned into a name. I think that is the most likely origin of the name. For one thing, it is a two-part name. If you look at the primary sources, when two-part names appear, it's because of Roman influences. So the names are either pure Latin, like Ambrosius Aurelianus, or they're partially Latin and partially Brythonic, such as Aurelius Caninus. Caninus, of course, being the Latin word for dog used as a name, but the Romans didn't use dog as a name, but the Britons did. But if the name is just pure Brythonic, like Melgwyn, then it's just one name. There's no two parts to it. So the fact that this is a two-part name that is supposed to be Brythonic makes it suspicious. Then there's the story itself. If we use, say, the story from Alexander the Great as the template, then Zeus seduced Olympias, the wife of Philip II of Macedon. And if you look at other examples of the story, it follows the same basic pattern. Olympias was real, Philip was real, Zeus was fictional. So the woman is real, her husband is real, the seducer is fictional. Applying that same template to the Arthurian version, then assuming that we're dealing with any real people at all, Igraine was real, Gorlios was real, Uther was fictional. All right, now let's get back to the story. So the real Gorlios is killed, and then Uther marries Igraine. Then 9 months later, Arthur is born. As part of the deal that Merlin made with Uther, Merlin takes the baby. In modern versions of this, Uther is made to be a jerk. And so it's understandable that Merlin will take the baby because he doesn't want Uther to raise it. But in the medieval versions, Uther's not presented that way. He's not presented as a particularly great king, but he's not bad. There's actually no explanation in the medieval version as to why Merlin would take the baby. It just becomes a plot device that sets up the quest for the rightful king. I think that it derives from Celtic tradition. In Celtic legend, it was quite common that the hero was not raised by his parents, but by foster parents. I'm not a good enough expert on Celtic culture to understand the full significance of that. But I do know that in certain historical examples, with a dynastic marriage, the woman, of course, moved to the home of her husband and lived with him, but sometimes the son was raised with her family as a way of strengthening the bond between the two families. Perhaps the legend is a reflection of that, but or there may have been other aspects to fostering among the ancient Celts that I don't know about. But anyway, and we're not told anything about Arthur's childhood. The story jumps ahead to the point where he's a young man, so probably in his late teens. Uther has died, and the realm has fallen into chaos, and they're trying to find the rightful king. And he will be known because he will be able to pass the test of pulling the sword from the stone. Now, I've seen a number of different explanations for the origin of the sword and the stone. The one that is repeated most often is that it comes from the Sarmatians. The Romans hired thousands of Sarmatians as mercenaries, and many of them were stationed in Britain. And they had a game whereby they drove a sword into the ground, and they took turns trying to pull it out of the ground. I don't think that's the origin of the sword and the stone at all. Okay. Ancient Celts were superstitious. They really believed that their great kings and war heroes had connections to the supernatural world. So in Celtic legends, it was not unknown for there to be magical tests that these characters would pass in order to prove their supernatural connections. Now, for over 500 years, the kings of Tara, the heads of the O'Neill clan, monopolized the high kingship in Ireland. According to legend, the true king of Tara would be known because he would pass 4 magical tests. The last of these tests is that he would place his hand upon the stone of destiny, which would cry out and acknowledge him the rightful king. I think that's the origin of the sword and the stone. First of all, it's a magical test. It's a test of kingship. It involves a stone, and it even includes the term rightful king, which is the same wording as in the other story. Now, it's quite possible that the Britons got the idea of using a sword from the Sarmatians, but the rest of it clearly comes from the Irish. Anyway, Arthur then gets acknowledged as king, and he begins his campaign as a war leader. But this is supposed to be a fictional story, remember? So this raises a couple of problems for when viewed as a work of fiction. First of all, he's become king too early. If this were a work of fiction, it should happen at the end of this. He should become king at the end of the story as reward. Secondly, he's the wrong kind of warrior. He's a military commander who led troops on the battlefield. That's not what we want from fiction. In fiction, there are 4 archetypes of the warrior, although one of them was only invented in the 20th century. Is the survivor. It comes from stories like All Quiet on the Western Front or Platoon. These are stories in which that deal on the horrors of war, and the main character is just trying to survive. So we can put that one aside, and we'll look at the other 3 historically. See, in fiction, we want to be able to identify with the character and identify with their motivations. Arthur's motivation is to bring order out of chaos and achieve peace. Well, that's very laudable, but it's not really something that most people can identify with. So consequently, historically, there have been 3 archetypes of the warrior. The first is the avenger. Achilles wants to avenge the death of his best friend. John Wick wants to avenge the murder of his puppy. Then there's the monster slayer. I mentioned Beowulf in the last episode, and he killed 3 monsters. Modern superheroes fit into the monster slayer archetype. That's why it was so easy to turn Thor into a superhero. He already had superpowers, and he already fit the archetype. Then the last one is the rescuer. Historically, the rescuer would save a damsel in distress. Although not necessarily. There's a series of legends centered around Charlemagne, which are similar to the legends around King Arthur. And one of the figures in this Carolingian cycle is the Lady Britomart, whose boyfriend has been kidnapped, so she straps on the armor and goes and rescues him. So there the genders have been flipped. And in more modern times, there have been other variations on the archetype, such as Saving Private Ryan. Of the three historical archetypes, this is the only one that Arthur might have fit, because of course Guinevere does get kidnapped, and there's at least one story in which Arthur rescues her. But it's not a significant story, and Arthur's not the one we associate with rescuing Guinevere. That's Lancelot. Okay. Well, anyway, Arthur then defeats his opponents and sets up the Round Table. And of course he marries Guinevere. Right, so if this was a work of fiction, that's where it should end. He's overcome the obstacles, defeated his opponents, married the beautiful princess, and he lived happily ever after. Except he didn't live happily ever after, did he? The story then does something very strange. It pushes our hero into the background. He's off being a good king, which again is significant in the real world, but in fiction it's boring. And the emphasis in the narrative shifts to that of the knights and their adventures. Now, I am aware of two other medieval legends in which the main character is a military commander who gets pushed into the background. These are the Carolingian cycle, which I've already mentioned, and the Song of El Cid. And in both cases, they're based on real people. Charlemagne was real, of course. He was crowned Emperor of the Franks on Christmas Day in the year 800. And El Cid is the nickname of a medieval 11th century Spanish warlord whose real name was Rodrigo Diaz. So the Arthurian story does not fit the template of a fictional legendary figure. It fits the template of a real person who passed into legend. Anyway, in this part of the story, Arthur only has to play a role in the love triangle with Guinevere's affair with Lancelot. And even then, he's the least significant of the characters. The emphasis is on Guinevere and Lancelot. That's where the romance is. That's where the drama is. Also, that wasn't originally part of the story. It was added in the 13th century. In fact, if we go back to the earliest surviving version of King Arthur's story From Birth to Death, which is found in Geoffrey of Monmouth's highly fanciful History of the Kings of Britain, which was written in the 1130s, not only is there no affair between Guinevere and Lancelot, there's no Lancelot. Lancelot was added by a French author named Chrétien de Troyes in the 1160s. And there's a huge debate as to where he came from. I'm not getting involved in that debate because there's no way to reach a truly definitive answer, at least as far as I can tell anyway. Now, if we look at the medieval versions of these stories, they're often not very accessible to modern audiences because the emphasis was on winning glory. That's because the written versions were intended for the ruling elite of the Middle Ages, the warrior class. Now, often this glory consisted of simply wandering around, having random encounters with other knights, fighting them, and then whoever won would get the glory. And these knights were often not evil, they were just there. Okay. Even older stories that had been drawn into the Arthurian cycle were changed in order to fit this pattern. Tristan and Isolde is derived from an old Celtic legend. If you're not familiar with Tristan and Isolde, Mark was king of Cornwall. See, there's no continuity in these stories. Gorlios was Duke of Cornwall, but Mark is king of Cornwall. But anyway, Tristan was Mark's nephew. Mark married Isolde, but then Tristan and Isolde fell in love. At first they tried to deny their love, but then they succumb to it and they begin an affair, which they try and keep secret, but then rumors start to spread, and finally the whole thing ends in disaster. It's the same basic outline of of Guinevere's affair with Lancelot. I think when they made up this story of Guinevere and Lancelot, they simply took the basic outline from Tristan and Isolde. But anyway, The story of in the 13th century, the story of Tristan and Isolde became Sir Tristan and Lioness, and it remained that way for several centuries. The love affair, which is the plot of the original story, became a subplot. And yes, Mark was jealous of Tristan because he suspected that Tristan was sleeping with Isolde, but he was more jealous of him because Tristan had more glory than he did. It's all about glory. Now, there's one significant difference, and that is an adventure involving King Arthur himself, which I think is very significant. Arthur, of course, has this reputation for upholding justice, but was that added to the story later, or where did it come from? I think it was always there, but there isn't very much evidence to support this. But anyway, the story I want to tell does give some support to this idea. So I'm following the version in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. Geoffrey was ashamed of the period of peace. You'll remember that Gildas said it lasted 20 years. Geoffrey cut it down to only 5. Then a totally fictitious emperor, Roman emperor named Lucius, demanded that Arthur pay tribute. Arthur then assembled a council of advisors asking them, should he pay tribute in order to maintain peace, or should he go to war? And he's advised to go to war because peace is bad. Peace makes men lazy and pleasure-loving and sends the message that Britons are cowards. So this is the attitude towards peace of the warrior class, right? Which is not reflected in the more usual interpretation of the legend that peace is good. And of course goes against Arthur's whole stated purpose of bringing order out of chaos and maintaining peace. But in Geoffrey, Arthur doesn't have that purpose. Okay. Anyway, Arthur then declares war on Lucius, assembles an army, crosses the Channel, and invades northern Gaul. And as he's marching through Normandy, he has a dream in which a bear is attacked by a dragon that comes out of the west, and the dragon kills the bear. Arthur is distressed by this because he thinks it's a bad omen, but he's advised, no, it's a good omen. The bear represents a giant that Arthur's somehow going to encounter, and Arthur's the dragon, and Arthur's going to kill the giant. But that doesn't make any sense. For one thing, it specifically says that the dragon comes out of the west. Arthur didn't come out of the west, he came out of the north. In Britain in relationship to Normandy, Britain's not west of Normandy, it's north of it. Now you will remember in episode 8 when I talked about Arthur's death and my ideas of reconstruction of what happened, I said that Melgwyn of Gwynedd rebelled against Arthur and Mordred switched sides. Okay, we don't know the true origin of the name Arthur, but it doesn't contain Arth, which means bear. So I argue that the bear does not represent the giant, the bear represents Arthur. Gildas referred to Melgwyn as Dragon of the Island. Melgwyn is the dragon, and he came out of Gwynedd, which is in northern Wales, that's in the west. I believe that the dream was originally a portent of Arthur's downfall, Melgwyn's rebellion and Arthur's death. But when the story was changed, the dream wasn't cut out, it was moved, and its meaning was reinterpreted, although the wording was kept the same. The dragon still comes out of the west, even though in this new context that doesn't make any sense. Anyway, sure enough, while on campaign, Arthur hears about a giant who's terrorizing the countryside. So he tells the army to halt and wait and camp, while he, Kay, and Bedivere go and deal with the giant. Now this is very significant, because even if you look at, say, Guinevere being kidnapped, that's something personal, right? That's the queen, a known character who has relationships with Arthur and Lancelot, being kidnapped. But here we have something completely different. Arthur doesn't know any of these people around here. He doesn't have any reason to care about them. And yet, when he finds out they're being terrorized by a giant, he decides to do the right thing because it is the right thing, even though he has no personal stake in it. Now, as his knights are scouting around to find the giant, one of them comes across an old woman by a grave, and she says that the giant kidnapped Helena, the niece of Duke Hoel of Brittany, and the old woman was Helena's nurse. When the giant tried to violate Helena, she fought back so fiercely that she ended up being killed. Then the giant violated the nurse. This, when Arthur finds out about this, so enrages him, he tells his two knights, Kay and Bedivere, to stand back. He's going to handle the giant personally. And he does. He kills the giant. Now, in medieval folk tales, giants were not considered to be tall humans. They were considered a different species, a more animalistic species. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the giant here is accused not only of rampaging through the countryside, but specifically of attacking women. They took chivalry very seriously. And this is not properly understood by modern audiences. You get, for example, you'll get people talking about prima nocta, which is supposedly this law that in the Middle Ages, when peasants were married, the local lord had the right to sleep with the bride on the wedding night. Yeah, prima nocta never existed. First of all, the term is never used in the Middle Ages at all. It was invented sometime later. There are a handful of examples of lords behaving that way. However, these examples are in fiction, and they're always depicted as evil lords who are abusing their power. Furthermore, if this was an actual practice, the church would have condemned it, because not only was it an assault, it would also have been adultery. So it's unclear how this went from being a sign that you're dealing with a villain to people believing that it was an actual legal thing with a Latin term. But yeah, that's a total misunderstanding. There's no such thing as prima nocta. Anyway, I think that because anyway, this is why I believe that Arthur's reputation for justice was always there, because he's the only one who does act in a purely just way, and he's doing it already in the 12th century. Now, as time went on, the level of literacy changed. It rose. So in the second half of the 15th century, these stories of these knights, which modern scholars refer to as the genre of the knights errant, went through a fundamental shift. The emphasis shifted from knights winning glory to the kinds of things that we're used to, the kinds of things like Arthur killing the giant because he's on a rampage, doing the right thing. And this is because the stories had to be geared for a wider audience who were not members of the warrior class. It's also in this period that we get the first written versions of the Robin Hood legend. And of course, Robin Hood is the champion of the people, right? Now, Sir Thomas Malory wrote 8 Arthurian stories. And they were meant to be read in chronological order. Arthur has a significant role in 3 of them, but never once is he the main character. This is common for written versions of Arthurian stories in the Middle Ages. Now, Malory died sometime in the 1470s, 1470s, 1,000 years out there. Then came William Caxton. Notice it was Sir Thomas Malory. Malory was a member of the warrior class. He had fought in the 100 Years' War. He'd fought in the Wars of the Roses. Okay. Now we get William Caxton, not Sir William Caxton, a commoner. Caxton was a merchant. He also set up the first printing press in England. And the arrival of this printing press is both a sign of the rise of literacy and also helped foster the rise of literacy because it made books cheaper, more accessible. According to his own account, people kept asking him to print a version of the Arthurian stories. So he took Malory's 8 stories and edited them down into one story. You got to remember that in those days there was no such thing as copyright. However, he didn't steal credit. He still credited Malory. Okay, but he did significantly change Malory's stories. He cut out an awful lot of the emphasis on glory and changed things around. Now he edited it down into one story. It's a long story because he included elements from all 8, but it is one story. And on top of that, it is Arthur's story. This is the first time we get a written version of the Arthurian legends in which Arthur is the main character. They'd been doing that with pseudo-histories like the History of the Kings of Britain, but this is the first time that it's the legends. Okay? And I don't think for an instant that it's a coincidence that this was done by a commoner, because Arthur was more important to the general population. With peace and justice, that was what they were concerned with. And I also don't think it's a coincidence that the book was published in 1485. That was the last year of the Wars of the Roses, which was a series of civil wars spread out over about 30 years as different branches of the royal family fought for the throne. Victory went to Henry Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, who became Henry VII. The Tudors were Welsh, and Henry played up King Arthur in his propaganda, presenting himself as a new Arthur, bringing order out of chaos, maintaining justice and peace. Okay, but he couldn't have done that unless this view of Arthur was already in the popular imagination. It just hadn't been written down before. Okay, so what we get with Le Morte d'Arthur is the merging of the aristocratic view of the legends with the oral traditions that had been passed down by the people. So the two finally merged together. And Le Morte d'Arthur is considered to be probably the best collection of the Arthurian legends from the Middle Ages, perhaps even the best ever, and all subsequent versions of the story have been based on this version. So that's how we've ended up with the legend the way that we're used to it. Now, that's it. We've come to the end of this episode. If you've gotten to the end, I thank you. I thank you for coming on this journey with me. And I hope that you might give a comment, a thumbs up, maybe share this with someone else. And goodbye.